Alo. 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 1 2 3 4. Alo. Đây là cái khóa ra. Có một người. À, anh có cần chuyển này sang lần sau không? Có gói đi khỏi thôi. Biết được rồi. Thì em lấy cái dây nặng. Anh ngồi đây luôn.
Alo, alo, 1 2 3, alo, 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 1 2 3, alo, rồi, 1 2 3 4, alo, alo. Nghe rõ không Huyền ơi? Alo, nghe rõ không Huyền? Huyền ơi, alo, nghe rõ không Huyền ơi? Alo, alo, nghe không Huyền? Alo, alo.
Alo.
Nghe rõ
Rồi,
không?
rồi được rồi, được. Ok.
Ok đúng không? Nghe ok đúng không?
Nãy không ra được tiếng.
Ok ha, rồi thank you.
Anh để sẵn cái background chưa? Để sẵn background luôn. Ủa thầy kia vô luôn rồi hả? Eric gì đó hay là người khác?
Có khách rồi đó.
Thầy là Kevin. Thầy là Kevin. Cảm ơn, ổn chưa? Hello Cẩm. Cẩm đâu rồi? Không ra à? Đâu rồi? Màn hình chính đâu rồi?
Cái máy nước nó bị hư, nó đang sửa.
Sửa rồi. Ủa là Cẩm, em liên hệ Phương chưa vậy? Rồi đúng không? Phương nói là lát tới hay sao? Sao không nghe tiếng em nói vậy? Bật mic lên mới nghe được một tiếng rồi ta, không nghe âm thanh gì luôn á thật. Phải không? Phải bật mic lên là nói được đúng không?
Nghe chưa, nghe chưa?
Dạ đúng rồi, vậy là có mic là mới nghe, còn không là không nghe. Ok, hiểu rồi.
Em mới bấm một nút nút xanh ở bên đó đó.
Dạ.
Không, rồi bấm nút xanh talk.
Rồi, alo
À,
chưa?
rồi nghe đúng rồi, tắt mic là không nghe. Ok, good, rất good.
Đỉnh của chóp chưa? Đỉnh của chóp chưa?
Của chớp rồi, đợi tít tít của anh á.
À,
Chờ tít tít của anh mà chưa thấy.
lúc nào là tít phát một tắt điện thoại luôn, rồi tít phát hai nha.
Đúng rồi, hợp lý.
Tít phát hai là bị trừ đó.
Option. Ủa, này nó full màn hình luôn à? Chưa.
Ủa Huyền ơi, cái số lượng offline là bao nhiêu vậy Huyền?
Tầm 30.
30 hả?
Dạ.
Tầm 30 chưa?
Mấy cái chai này đâu nhìn thấy đâu, bỏ lui xuồng chốt phải không?
Chai gì anh?
Thì là mấy cái ban đầu này, cái chỗ đầu này, cái cam cam nó không nhìn thấy nè.
Để nó anh, không sao đâu.
Lui.
Ai muốn vô hình thì ngồi lít ra. Quan trọng là mấy bác online đông thôi, còn mấy bác offline thì cũng tương đối là không sao đâu, như đây đủ xài à. Nay có bác Đảng qua hỗ trợ anh. CC bác Đảng. Ủa vậy là thay bình nước mới hả? Hai chị em có nghe gì không? Không ai nghe mình nói rồi.
Nước hoa mới luôn nha Huyền.
À, chị Duyên ơi, có điện thoại chị Duyên ơi.
Đi chụp kênh chị Duyên ơi.
Duyên ơi, điện thoại chị Duyên ơi.
Hello, test 1, 2, 3. Hello, Kevin, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. You're very clear.
Very clear. Can you say something so we can check the signal?
Sure. Sure. Glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, good. So you can, Kevin, you can share the screen.
Yep. Let me get set up there.
Okay, now we can see your slide, and okay, the signal is very well, very good today.
Excellent. Never know when you're going to have technical problems.
Okay. Um, Hello, Kevin. So now we start at sharply 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. US time. Okay. Good morning, everyone from Vietnam side, and also good evening from the US. So today I'm very honored to welcome Professor Kevin Blanc. He's a professor of economics at Boston University, the United States. He also research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research and president-elect of Society of Labor Economics. He also the editor-in-chief of Journal of Labor Economics. And today, actually, we want to welcome you in person to deliver the talk as well. We have like communication and gathering meeting, but unfortunately, we have like the pandemic now. So maybe in the future, the University of Economics, Ho Chi Minh City, warmly hope that you can visit UEH and Vietnam in the near futures. So today, Kevin will deliver the talk entitled An Agenda for Labor Economics Research in an Uncertain World. Then his talk will last in around 45 until 1 hour, maybe more or less. Then after that, we have like some Q&A question. I set the prioritize for the guest audience from this room to raise the question first. And after that, we have like the online participant. Then now your stage is yours. And big hand to welcome Kevin.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by thanking the University of Economics, Ho Chi Minh City, and the Journal of Asian and Business Economic Studies for inviting me to give this talk. And I, too, am very sorry that I can't be there in person. I've never been to Vietnam, but I've heard wonderful things. And I hope someday I am indeed able to visit. At the same time, let me say that I've been set a challenging task, which is to describe an agenda for labor economics and to do so particularly in the light of the great uncertainty in the world. Now, I have to admit, I've never been able to set an agenda for myself. If I look at the papers that I currently have submitted or under preparation for journals, I think you'll see they lack a common theme. 2 are largely empirical papers related to criminal activity, one on loan sharks, and the other on the labor supply of drug dealers. At the other extreme, one is entirely theoretical model of courtship. In between, there are papers that combine theory and empirical work to examine race discrimination in the United States labor market and changes in skill use in the United States between 1959 and 1983. There are also papers with a strong methods component, one on the role of scaling decisions in explaining findings of fade out in the effect of early childhood interventions, and another on estimation of dynamic structural models with an application to teachers. My own inability to follow a single research agenda should undoubtedly disqualify me from setting an agenda for anyone else. Still, I hope that I will have some useful insights. I'm going to spend some time talking about why labor economics is a good field for a young economist. But most of my talk, I think the most important part, will be about the second part, which is about approaches to labor economics. I'm going to spend most of the time talking about the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches to labor economics, and my best guess as to areas that are most likely to be fruitful approaches to research. I want to be clear, I do not have a crystal ball. Few economists writing 50 years ago would have predicted the enormous insights that would come from investigating the implications of imperfect information for economic models. Nevertheless, at the end of my talk, I will turn to the topic that forms the title of this talk and discuss what I see as the agenda for labor economics and wrap up with some concluding remarks. So Why study labor economics? Well, first of all, because it addresses, whoops, too much coming through. It addresses key parts of the economy, of which the labor market is a huge part. Education is also a huge part of the economy, as is the household sector, even though it's not included in GDP. Now, both household economics and education economics are increasingly fields in their own right, but much of their origin lies with labor economics, and labor economists continue to claim them as our own. In addition, labor economics addresses major societal issues. Oops, I think I skipped a bit here, sorry. Right. So we look at issues such as employment and wage levels, who marries whom, and fertility, both of which affect inequality, migration, which is an important issue in much of the world, discrimination and inequality, which are certainly important in the United States, but elsewhere as well. In addition, it addresses core policy issues. To talk about just a few, does raising the minimum wage reduce family income inequality? Does rewarding teachers for their students' test performance increase the quality of education or reduce it? Does requiring severance pay increase or decrease employment? None of these questions has an obvious answer, but they're surely important if we want to improve people's lives. But I have to admit that economics teaches us that people respond to incentives. And frankly, economists may be more responsive to certain types of incentives than most people are. Academic economists care about the respect of their peers and the indicators of that respect. So an inspiring young economist might ask about the prospects for gaining recognition by publishing papers on labor economics. Now, when I started as a young assistant professor, the professional hierarchy was clear. Labor economists were not anywhere near the top. Theorists and economists were the best economists. Empirical research was for people who were not smart enough to do theory. I remember being asked at a meeting with our PhD students whether it was possible to go on the job market with an empirical paper, whether you needed a theory paper. My first indication that the world has changed since I was a young tenured professor is who wins the John Bates Clark Medal. As most of you know, this is an award given to the top economists in the United States under the age of 40. A majority of the recipients who won it at least 30 years ago have gone on to win the Nobel Prize. And 30 years ago, none of the contributions of Clark Medal winners would have been described as important primarily because of its empirical content. The winners were recognized for their contributions to micro or macroeconomic theory or to econometric methods. That changed in 1993. Larry Summers certainly had made important theoretical contributions to public finance, but he was doing empirical work on the labor market, and in particular, inter-industry wage differentials. David Card, the next winner, was an entirely empirical labor economist. Kevin Murphy, forgot about him, was also primarily a labor economist. He'd done some theoretical work, but he was primarily a labor economist. He's since moved on to health economics. Daron Acemoglu, he works in practically every field, but he teaches in the labor PhD sequence at MIT. Roland Fryer has done good theory, but he's primarily an empirical labor economist. He's done important work on discrimination and on education policy. Parag Pathak also did important work on mechanism design, but also on the effects of different types of schools on student achievement. The second indicator that labor is a fruitful field of study for a young economist is the status of labor economics journals. SCImajo, one of the leading organizations that ranks journals, ranked the Journal of Labor Economics as the #9 journal in economics. Now, 3 of their top 8 are finance journals, and I would argue don't belong in the comparison. That's according to this one ranking, at least. Joly is the first journal below the famous top 5. The Journal of Human Resources ranks 29th in Saimajo. But if we exclude business, management, and finance journals, it is behind only leading general interest journals and 2 other field journals. Now, I admit it's easy to pick and choose among the numerous available journal rankings. Still, the other place I tend to go to look at rankings, besides Saimajo, is Research Papers in Economics, RepEc. And there, I use recursive discounted citations over the last 10 years. Joly ranks 2nd among field journals outside finance, and the Journal of Human Resources ranks 3rd. Now, I don't want in any way to suggest that you should take these rankings very seriously, but they should reassure you that publishing in good labor economics journals is a pathway to recognition in the profession. So let me now turn to approaches to labor economics. Most of the talk is going to be about their strengths and weaknesses. I view the main approaches to labor economics as causal inference, often referred to as reduced form or natural experiment approach. And I refer to it as the medical model. Policy simulation, often referred to as structural labor economics, or in my mind, the physics model. And again, I don't find that name particularly helpful. And then theory and theory-inspired correlation models, for which I frankly don't have a simple shorthand for you. It's the way I was taught to do economics. So let me start with the causal inference or medical model. We think if we're doing medicine, if we're doing medical research, we think a medicine might be effective for treating some condition or illness. We run a randomized controlled trial to determine whether it's effective. If a treatment already exists, we determine whether it's more effective than the current treatment. We also test for side effects, or in the terminology of economics, unintended consequences. I should say, generally we worry about undesirable or negative unintended consequences, but we should be aware that sometimes they're positive. Wearing a mask and maintaining social distance not only reduces the spread of COVID-19, but it also reduces the spread of other diseases. Now, the first RCTs to get much attention were the negative income tax experiments in the United States and Canada. Negative income tax, subsequently called basic income guarantee or a guaranteed annual income, was intended to replace many or all of the income subsidy programs, and most notably aid to families of dependent children, or AFDC. Advocates of the negative income tax were concerned that that AFDC discouraged marriage and encouraged childbearing out of wedlock because it was only available to parents and because married couples could receive little, if any, support. The negative income tax experiments randomly made some participants eligible for the negative income tax, and others remained eligible only for AFDC. The RCTs showed that even a much more generous program can end up making a large share of AFDC recipients worse off, and that the experimental group was more likely to divorce. These findings were sufficient to end serious policy discussion of the negative income tax for many years. Another influential set of RCTs addressed the debate between progressives and conservatives over how to best get welfare recipients into the labor force. Progressives were largely convinced the problem was the recipients' lack of marketable skills, and they therefore advocated education first. In their view, recipients should first be enrolled in education or training programs to prepare them for the labor market, and then only then be assisted in finding a job. In contrast, conservatives believe that the problem was a lack of good work habits and work experience, and that the solution was to push welfare recipients into employment. Over time, they believed, this work-first approach, this work-first approach would help the recipients develop the job-related skills they would need to get better jobs. The results of the experiment were clear. Over the first 4 years, Work First was better for recipients. Longer-term results were less clear. Education First participants seemed to catch up, but there was no evidence that they surpassed Work First participants. The general conclusion was that Work First was probably better for participants and certainly much cheaper for the rest of us. But the most striking finding was that the most successful approach did something different that neither the progressives nor the conservatives supported. It allowed trained caseworkers to assign participants to Work First or Education First based on their assessment of the participant's situation. Relative to Work First, this produced significant gains for participants at a modest cost to the rest of us. Now, the RCTs I've described so far were expensive and complicated. They required enormous funding from government and specialized organizations to conduct them. The labor economists have conducted valuable RCTs at modest cost. These include things like paying students to read, or other aspects of education policy, or changing the pay system in companies. An enterprising researcher can sometimes convince a large organization or company, or even the government, to perform an RCT. Well, RCTs are sometimes referred to as the gold standard. They have important limitations. The first is external validity. RCTs often use populations that are convenient or inexpensive. Undergraduate students are not necessarily representative of the population. They're of limited duration. A major evaluation of the Job Corps program, which is a job training program for teenagers and young adults, found large benefits during the first 4 years that participants were followed. But a subsequent follow-up using administrative data found both smaller effects in the administrative data than in the survey responses, and an immediate and sharp decline in the benefits after the 4 years that the experiment was ongoing. Do job training programs increase employment or merely rearrange who gets the jobs? Few RCTs are designed to measure positive or negative spillovers. More generally, RCTs require a condition known as SUTVA, or the stable unit treatment value assumption. This condition says that an individual's outcome depends only on his own treatment and not on the treatment that others receive. If the experimental treatment may affect the control group, this condition is violated. And finally, because they are typically theory-free, it is difficult to know what would happen if we did something close but not identical. Thus, we know that the Pfizer vaccine is highly effective if given in 2 doses 3 weeks apart. But what happens if they're given 4 months apart in order to allow everyone to get a first vaccine before anyone gets a second dose? While most researchers are aware of these limitations, they vary in the degree to which they pay attention to them. However, there are 2 issues that have received less attention than they deserve. The first is multiple hypothesis testing. For a while, it was common practice for researchers conducting an RCT to start by analyzing the entire population, and then especially if they fail to find a statistically significant effect, look for an effect in subpopulations. As a solution to that problem, researchers are increasingly required to have pre-registered their analysis plan so that analyses that were not part of the plan can be recognized as illegitimate. There are two problems with pre-registration. First, researchers may notice interesting patterns in the data that they did not anticipate. We should learn about these findings and simply recognize that they were not anticipated and risk being spurious. But the bigger problem in my mind is that pre-registration plans encourage researchers to employ teams of research assistants to think about all the possible analyses they might want to conduct. And when I say this, I say it with a fair amount of confidence, as my daughter, who's a PhD student, was hired to do exactly that. Now, as a consequence of this, researchers may actually test a very large number of hypotheses, many of which might not have been tried in the absence of the pre-registration plan. So the pre-analysis plan says, well, we'll do this for the entire population, then we'll do it separately for men and women, we'll do it separately for white and black people, we'll do it separately for young and old people, we'll do it for white men, and we'll do it for black men, and then for young white women, and then old white men, et cetera. And if you go through that, there are 29 tests, if I've done the calculation correctly. The odds of finding a statistically significant difference on one of these tests is quite high. So as an editor, I can say it's still uncommon for researchers to correct for multiple hypothesis testing, but it's becoming more common. The problem is that when they do worry about multiple hypothesis testing, economists typically use a technique due to Romano and Wolff. And what they do is they keep what's called the family-wise error rate at typically 0.05. Now let me skip the jargon and say exactly what that means. It means that if the null hypothesis of no difference is correct for all 29 hypotheses, we want the probability of falsely rejecting even one of those 29 null hypotheses to be no more than alpha, or as I said, typically 0.05. But this approach drives the power of the test to zero as the number of tests gets large. Let me give an example. Suppose the researcher initially chose a sample size of 400, 25 controls and 25 experimental observations from each of the 8 cells over 3 binary categories, i.e. one cell would be young European women. Based on some prior research, she expects the effect size to be 0.3 standard deviations. The test on the whole sample has considerable power. Using a one-tailed test, she has roughly an 85% chance of finding a significant effect if she's right. But suppose that she also tests the 8 subsamples. Not all 29 possible combinations, just the 8 subsamples. She has 8 independent tests and one that is weakly correlated with each of the other 8. In order to maintain a size of 0.05 overall, she needs to use a size of about 0.006 on each test. Thus, she needs a t-statistic to be greater than about 2.5 for a one-tailed test. The power of the test for the entire sample has now fallen to 0.7. That's not too bad. But as the number of tests goes up, the power continues to fall. But what about the subsamples? Now, they were always underpowered for detecting tests, detecting effects on the subsamples. On a single subsample, the power is only about 28%. But if you do Romano-Wolff, you end up with power of only about 0.07. So that failing to reject the null is almost completely uninformative. Now, there are many problems that cannot be answered with a randomized controlled trial. Some simply are not amenable to experimentation. Others would be immoral. In such settings, researchers using the medical model try to find an unintended experiment. Now, most people call these natural experiments, but most of them are not natural in any way that the word is commonly used. This is Josh Angrist, my friend and co-author in his full guru mode. Josh had a big influence on all of us in pushing natural experiments. His first major paper used the period during the Vietnam War when the United States used a lottery to determine draft eligibility. In that case, the United States government had unintentionally conducted an RCT, which Josh used to study the effect of military service on labor market outcomes. His perspective is captured in his textbook written with Steve Pischke, Mostly Harmless Econometrics. I highly recommend this book, but I also highly recommend that you recognize that it presents one perspective. This is David Card and Alan Kruger. I guess I should have had their names the other way. David used a sudden and unexpected influx of refugees into Miami to look at the effect of immigrants on the local labor market. David and Alan used a change in the minimum wage in New Jersey and compared fast food employment in New Jersey and nearby Pennsylvania to study the employment effects of the minimum wage. Now, neither of these studies has held up well against subsequent criticism, but they were enormously influential in opening up a style of research. This is their book, in which they push the idea that it is an advantage to be doing economics without theory. Now, Josh's lottery example is a nice one. Unfortunately, most of the time, nature is not as helpful. And the researcher must make the case that she has found an experiment. To give you a sense of how this evolves, I'm going to use the evolution of the literature on teen motherhood. Prior to the natural experiment approach, the typical approach was regression analysis. We used data on women who had and women who had not given birth as teens. We then regressed adult outcomes on having been a teen mother and controlled for factors that we could observe, such as parents' education, where they lived, their race. We consistently found pretty adverse effects on adult outcomes of having been a teen mother. Now, things changed when Arlene Geronimus and Sanders Kahneman came along, and they argued this just wasn't a very good comparison. Instead, they compared sisters, one of whom gave birth as a teen and one who had not. The adverse effects they found were much smaller than those implied by just comparing women who gave birth as a teen and one who did not, even with lots of controls. The adverse effects they found were also generally statistically insignificant, although admittedly they didn't have a great deal of data. Now, there were two problems with what they did, because this is a so-called natural experiment and not one carefully designed by the experiment. On the one hand, sisters are not identical. It is unlikely to be entirely a matter of luck that one but not the other gave birth as a teen. Thus, the researchers were likely to overstate any adverse effects. On the other hand, that famous Sutpho condition is likely to be violated. Family resources may be transferred from one sister to the other because the parents devote family resources to helping care for the grandchild, or because they punish the teen mother. In the former case, we would underestimate the adverse effect on the mother by ignoring the adverse effect on her sister. In the second case, we would overestimate it by comparing her with her sister. Recognizing those problems, Joseph Hotz, Susan Williams McElroy, and Seth Sanders proposed a different natural experiment. They argued that conditional on a small number of other factors, spontaneous abortion, more commonly called miscarriage, is medically random. Therefore, they argued that using a sample of women who experienced pregnancy as teenagers and using miscarriage as an instrument for the absence of a birth provides a consistent estimate of the effect of teen motherhood on the mothers. They generally found that rather than being hurt, the mothers, if anything, benefited from having been teen mothers, especially as they got older. Now, just in case anyone is not familiar with instrumental variables, in its simplest form, it can be thought of in the following way. First, compare the outcomes of women who miscarried with those who did not miscarry. This provides what is known as the intent to treat, the difference between those two groups. However, if some of the women who do not miscarry do not give birth because they have an abortion, we even have an effect averaged across a group, some of whom were affected by a birth, and some of whom were not affected because they had an abortion. Okay. Instrumental variables effectively loads up the intent to treat estimate to take account of this. It therefore estimates the effect of giving birth on those teens who give birth if and only if they do not have a miscarriage. Now, Adam Ashcraft and I pointed out that the miscarriage instrument isn't quite right. And the problem is that there's something called an induced abortion, which I'll call an abortion from now on. And some abortions preempt miscarriages. Therefore, miscarriages do not occur among a random sample of teens who would and would not have abortions. They are more common among those who would not have abortions. So we show that the proposed experiment from Hotz et al. Is biased towards finding a benign effect. Then we consider another possible experiment, which is comparing only teens who miscarried or gave birth, and we show that it's biased in the opposite direction. Therefore, we can put bounds on the effect of teen motherhood. Fortunately, the bounds are fairly tight. While the instrumental variable results show generally positive or zero effects, the OLS experiment that we propose shows generally mildly adverse effects, allowing us to conclude that any adverse effects are small. In later work with Yvon Fernandez-Val, we showed how to derive a point estimate and generally find small, often statistically insignificant adverse effects. Now, it's important to remember what these and other instrumental variable estimates tell us. In this case, they show the effect on the people whose behavior, in all cases, they show the effect on the people whose behavior is affected by the instrument. It can be a very poor estimate of the average effect across everyone. In the teen motherhood setting, we might expect that the teens whose lives would be most adversely affected by giving birth are the ones who are most likely to have an abortion and therefore not be affected by the instrument. Thus, the estimates provided by my co-authors and me are unlikely to be good estimates of what the average effect of being a teen mother. Okay. We're not finding the effect on a randomly chosen woman. If we're considering making abortion unavailable to teens, it may be a very poor estimate, even ignoring the effects that some policy has on who gets pregnant. It may be a better estimate of the effects of birth avoided through a teen pregnancy prevention program. Another way to get a good comparison group is to look at observations just below and just above some cutoff for treatment. Suppose government announces that individuals born before January 22nd, 1956, i.e. people who are at least 65 years old today, are eligible to receive the COVID-19 vaccine early, but those who were born on or after that date are not, i.e. those who are not yet 65 years old today. Now, it seems plausible that comparing outcomes for people who were born 65 years ago today and people born 65 years ago tomorrow provides a pretty good estimate of the effect of getting the vaccine early. If some people get around the rules and get the vaccine anyway, or some do not do so even though they're entitled to, we can pretty much fix the problem using instrumental variables. But I'm going to keep things simple by assuming that our subjects behave well. So in this picture, this is supposed to be age 65. I'm not sure why the number didn't come out. Right? If we look at people very, very close to this cutoff, people on one side, these are the people who are too young to qualify, and the people on this side who are just barely old enough to qualify. It seems like we have a pretty good comparison. But often our samples are small. We don't have a lot of people right here and right here. So it'll be tempting to compare, let's say, everybody who was between 64, at least 64 years old, but not yet 65, with people who are at least 65 years old, but not yet 66. As we expand the range around the cutoff date, the assumption the two groups are otherwise identical becomes less and less plausible. So if we go back to age 60 and up to age 70 and do the comparison 60 to 65 minus 1 day and 65 to 70, it's not so convincing that we have a really good comparison group. So the solution is to fit a line, as we've done here, on one side of the cutoff. So these are the people, they look like they're about 61 to 65, and estimate a line on the other side of the cutoff, which would be, if it was balanced, 65 to 69. And then we take the gap right at age 65, and that's our estimate of the effect of being eligible for the early stage, the early stage vaccine. Now, there's a literature on how to choose how far to go with this line. There's a literature on whether it's better for it to be linear or quadratic. I'm not going to go into that. Seems like a pretty good bet that people don't have much control over the day on which they were born 65 years ago. In other settings, the assumption that people on each side of the cutoff are similar may be much less plausible. If households with incomes below 300% of the poverty line are eligible for free health insurance, but those with incomes even a tiny bit above that level are not, we will not be surprised to find a lot more households just below than just above that cutoff. And we might suspect, I would suspect, that there was something special about the households that were unable or uninterested in slightly reducing their income in order to qualify. Now, my goal here is not to give a much too brief overview of aspects of econometrics, but rather to clarify when certain approaches are likely to be helpful and what can be learned from them. Now, in our COVID-19 example, we do not learn the effect of the vaccination program. At best, we learn the effect of the vaccination program on people close to age 65. It is also unlikely to be true that people are only affected by their own treatment. There are well-known externalities from vaccines. If enough other people are vaccinated, the effect of being vaccinated could be adverse for an individual. because you might be more likely to have side effects than to suffer from COVID-19. But they could still be desirable for the whole society because you are providing protection for other people. The regression discontinuity approach does not tell us the effect of the policy on society, unless we strongly believe that there are no other effects of the policy. This point becomes particularly important for studies of retention and grade. The evidence is increasingly clear that among children close to the cutoff for being retained, retention in an early grade does not have much long-term effect. But then when older children are retained, they are worse off. It does not follow that a policy that promotes all children to the next grade is a good idea. First, we don't know about the effect of retention on the children whose performance is substantially below the cutoff. That's the point that, that we're finding the effect here, we're not finding the effect here, or for that matter, here. Second, we do not know the effect of the policy on motivating students to work harder. It might be a good policy if it motivates students more, even if it hurts, given the policy, students were a little unlucky on the exam and who would have been better off had they been a little luckier. Probably the most common approach used by people using the medical model is what's called differences in differences. This is a long history and it comes from the epidemiological side of medical research. As early as 1885, John Snow used the technique to argue that cholera came not from bad vapors, but from drinking water contaminated with sewage. He showed that cholera increased more in neighborhoods served by the polluted water than in those served with water that was unaffected. So at times the water was unpolluted, and other times it was polluted. When the water was polluted, those neighborhoods that were using that water saw a bigger increase in cholera than those neighborhoods that were not using the water. Now, what differences in differences does is it replaces the assumption that treatment is randomly assigned with respect to the expected value of the outcome in the absence of treatment. It replaces it with the assumption that it is randomly assigned with respect to the expected change in the outcome. Expected change in the outcome, I want to emphasize that, in the absence of treatment. In one sense, this is a powerful method. It is often possible to find an untreated group or a group that is treated early and another that is treated late. Right? We could test the effectiveness of a COVID-19 vaccine that has been widely administered by comparing the change in infection rate of a group that received it early with the change in the infection rate of some group that has not yet received it. The critical assumption is that in the absence of the vaccine, the infection rates would have changed similarly. This is an untestable assumption, particularly if the two groups have experienced different infection rates. Readers may be skeptical about this assumption. Researchers typically try to provide statistical evidence to support its plausibility. It is common for them to show that the infection rates moved in parallel fashion prior to the vaccine program. There are, unfortunately, a number of problems. In the absence of the vaccine, would the infection rate have changed by the same absolute amount or by the same proportion? Unless the initial rates are the same, both cannot be true. Now, what I just said is not literally true, but it's true for all practical purposes. And we rarely have the statistical power to show that only one of these counterfactuals applied in the period prior to the vaccination program. Other researchers use multiple groups with different groups treated at different times. If the vaccination program has 3 phases, we can use those first treated in phases 2 and 3 as controls for those treated in phase 1. So in this example, This is group 1. It gets treated first. These are groups 2 and 3. This experiment where they were going in parallel before group 1 got the treatment, now we can look at the change in group 1 relative to the change in group 2 and 3. Similarly, we can use group 1 in this later period, which has not seen a change, it was already treated, and group 3, which has not yet been treated, as controls for group 2, which is treated now. And I don't have it on the picture, but if group 3 were treated eventually, then groups 1 and 2 could serve as controls for group 3. Now note that this is drawn in such a way that the effect is larger on group 1 than it is on group 2. Okay. Andrew Goodman Bacon has pointed out that there are issues with the way we typically do this. The typical approach is something called two-way fixed effects. And what we do is we regress the outcome variable on some individual controls, a dummy variable for each group, a dummy variable for each time period, and then of course, there should be a G. There's a random error term for each individual in each time period. Now, when we do this, we implicitly use, or actually explicitly use, ordinary squares to decide how to weight the experiments. And it turns out that it's not obvious that they get weighted in the right way. On the other hand, he raises a more important problem. That one actually doesn't worry me that much. The more important problem is if the vaccine takes some time to become fully effective, then two-way fixed effects can give the wrong answer. Intuitively, what's going on is that since the infection rate, or I guess I'll call this the non-infection rate since it's going up, continues to change over time, even after the second group starts getting the vaccine, then we can actually end up getting completely the wrong result. Right? So in the first case, in this example, there's no difference between the two groups in the infection rate before anybody gets the vaccine. And we estimate for the first experiment, the average over this period, the average effect over this period. That's not too bad. Right? It'd be better if we followed it over time, but that's not too bad. But look what happens when we do the second group. This is the control. This is the difference before the second group got the vaccine. This is the difference after it got the vaccine. And we can see, because the effect was continuing to grow for group 1, then we're actually going to find that there was an adverse effect on group 2. And when we weight the two in a way that's hard to figure out, but is done automatically by two-way fixed effects, we can literally get the wrong answer overall. Now, in the interest of keeping the length of this talk reasonable, and because I really, well, Ariella Cohn-Lang and I have devoted an entire article to some of the difficulties with differences and differences, I'm not going to discuss them more extensively. I do, however, want to be clear that Ariella and I did not, and I am not here, suggesting that differences and differences should not be part of the labor economist toolkit. But I do believe that we should view it with much more skepticism than has been the case among labor economists devoted to the medical model. So let me now turn to an alternative. The policy simulation, structural labor economics, physics model, whatever you want to call it. One obvious weakness of the medical model is our inability to project outside the parameters of the experiment. We know that the Pfizer vaccine is highly effective if administered in 2 doses 21 days apart. It's a reasonable guess that small deviations from that schedule aren't going to matter. But some countries have chosen to modify it significantly. It looks like the United States is going to do that. They're going to choose to get many more people a first vaccine rather than ensuring an effective vaccine for a smaller number. The political leaders in these countries have been accused of not listening to the science, but there is no science. We expect that the lesser immune response from a single dose will reduce the effectiveness of the vaccine. But we don't know whether the difference in effectiveness is medically important. If we could write a sufficiently complete model and estimate its parameters, we could answer questions about policies for which we do not have direct experimental or quasi-experimental evidence. Similarly, we might be able to decide whether an experiment conducted in China or Uruguay would be applicable to Vietnam. So that's what the physics approach tries to do. The researcher specifies what she believes to be the key elements of the world that need to be captured in the model, and then estimates the underlying parameters. Armed with the parameters of the specified model, the researcher can then perform policy experiments. Imagine what we would do if we wanted to estimate what would happen to the supply of teachers if we raised teacher salaries by 20%. We can model occupation choice based on assumptions about the utility function, how the wage path depends on factors such as general and occupation-specific experience, and the cost of changing from one occupation to another. We can estimate the parameters of these equations, and then ask how many people would choose to be in each occupation if we increase salaries, teacher salaries by 20%. Now, you may have noticed a problem already. I've described utility functions, mobility equations, wage equations, mobility costs, but I haven't said anything about demand. Wages are the result of the interaction of supply and demand for different types of workers, at least according to the dominant model of the labor market. And even in the public sector, wages are likely to be influenced by supply and demand. So how do we know when the model is good enough? Even if we feel reasonably confident that the model's coverage is sufficient and that we do not need to model demand, we still may wonder whether the model is correctly specified. Perhaps the semi-log wage equation should not be linear in years of education, but should assume that only certifications such as completing secondary school or holding a university degree matter. Now, what's typically done by practitioners in this area is they show that their model fits well. What they mean by that is that it does a good job of replicating their data. Unfortunately, this claim is rarely accompanied by a formal metric by which we can judge that claim. Typically, the authors provide a small number of graphs and claim that the distributions, or sometimes even just the means, of the predicted and actual outcomes look similar, where similar is undefined. I'm sympathetic to these authors. What they're doing reflects the fact that estimating complex models is very time consuming. I've been there. It's difficult for any researcher who spent a year estimating a model to conclude that the model just isn't good enough and that they should give up. Statements about sunk costs notwithstanding, they are more likely to keep modifying the model to make it fit well enough, and if necessary, conclude that it does, even if it's not obvious that it does. But even when it is obvious that the model fits well by any reasonable metric, in-sample fit is a very weak test of whether the model is good enough. Maria Palacios and I show that within a class of dynamic structural models, all of which fit well within sample, we get very different predictions from the same policy simulation. Ideally, what we would like to see is if a model predicts well out of sample. Unfortunately, this often is not feasible. The solution that Maria and I used was to hold back part of the sample and see whether our predictions for the part not used for estimation match the actual outcomes within sampling error. This does two things. It provides us with a metric. And fortunately, it turned out in our case, at least, that it allowed us to reject a few of the models. But unfortunately, many survive even this exercise. And those that do still make very different policy predictions. A second problem, common to much of the physics approach, is that policy estimates are rarely accompanied by estimates of their standard errors. We read that the policy will reduce labor supply by 7.6%, as if that were an exact prediction, rather than one that probably comes with a very large standard error. This is simply bad practice. And fortunately, there are signs that researchers are beginning to recognize that. So the last thing I want to do is to make a pitch for theory, and theory as a guide to empirical work. Both the medical and physics models are incomplete. They're designed to answer questions such as, what is the effect of the child allowance on fertility? The medical approach attempts to answer this question without a model. The physics approach assumes we know the model. Now, let me suggest that when your young child asks where babies come from, the best estimate is that a child allowance accounts for 7.6% of them is not a good answer. It's not even a good answer to the question, how do people decide how many children to have? Theory is essential for addressing many of our most pressing questions. In the United States, addressing the large disparities among people of different races is once again a central issue requiring urgent attention. To some extent, the approaches I've already discussed are helpful. There is good evidence from natural experiments that interracial contact between people who are not too different, such as students whose academic performance is not substantially different, reduces prejudice. But there is also evidence that integration can lead to a backlash in which Black students risk being accused of acting white. Theory may, and I emphasize may, help us design studies to help us understand when interracial contact reduces prejudice and when it does not. To me, theory is most interesting when it provides a guide to the empirical work that will test it. Edward Lazier explained the existence of mandatory retirement by the use of backloaded earnings profiles designed to deter shirking and other malfeasance. More generally, his model implies that the contract between the firm and workers will prevent more senior workers from working as much as they want while obligating junior workers to work more than they want. Shulamit Khan and I pointed out that we can test the equilibrium predictions of the model. And in particular, that the firm-specific capital model has the opposite implications. And we showed, using Canadian data, that the desire to work more hours at one's usual rate of pay declines with seniority. This is inconsistent with Lazier's model and therefore casts doubt on the policy implication that outlawing mandatory retirement was socially inefficient. In a sense, the approach described in this section is the opposite of the medical approach. While the latter is designed to elicit causal effects, the empirical work I've just described is about using previously unknown correlations in order to support or cast doubt on a theory. To the extent that the theory provides a basis for policy, this can increase or decrease our confidence in the policy recommendation. So let me wrap up by talking about what I was actually asked to address. My charge is to talk about the agenda for labor economics in an uncertain world. Yet I've spent most of my time simply reviewing the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches to labor economics. I'm going to admit that I've done this in part to put off addressing the really hard question implicit in the title. But I've also done it to underscore what I believe is an important lesson. There is no single right way to do labor economics, even no single right way to do policy-oriented labor economics. Each approach has its strengths and weaknesses. There are policies that cannot be evaluated with existing data or plausible experiments, and their effect may depend on our choice of theory or may depend on unknown parameters that we cannot easily estimate. Sometimes, however, one of these approaches will be feasible, so our agenda must be eclectic. This does not mean that every individual researcher must be eclectic. We've known for almost 350 years that there are gains from specialization, but I will admit that I find it more fun to work in different ways and on a wide variety of topics. Doctoral students should be exposed to the full range of approaches before they focus on those they find more interesting or in which they have an absolute or comparative advantage. And they need sufficient understanding of all of them in order to benefit from the insights produced by approaches other than their own. There are, of course, big questions facing us, and labor economics can play a part in addressing them. It seems inevitable that global climate change and our attempts to limit its extent will cause massive shifts in production and large-scale migration. We know very little about the dynamics of adjustment from one equilibrium to another. The pace of technological change is unprecedented. It is an open question whether the disruptions this causes are temporary before we return to a full employment world in which workers are more productive than they were, or whether we are moving to a world in which there is a large swath of workers who cannot find rewarding employment. Optimists point out that we have a history of major upheavals that have threatened to create a permanently underemployed class, but these fears have never been realized. But we also once thought that all swans were white. Avoiding the pessimist fears may require labor economists to be creative about how work can be reorganized. There are a lot of big questions out there, but most of us are better at thinking about smaller pieces of the puzzle. Does a particular policy help move workers from a declining industry or occupation to a growing one? What types of workers are helped? In some cases, we may be able to rely on experiments. In other cases, we may need to build and estimate models. And yet others, we may need new theories to explain new data. And the big challenges ahead of us do not mean that we have solved all of the old ones. We still need to figure out better ways. We still need to find out better ways to teach our children and train our workers. We are way behind medicine in our understanding of even basic questions such as what are the effects of tracking or streaming? What is the best way to group students? How do we incentivize teachers to do better? Are incentives not the problem? If the issue is selection, how do we do a better job of attracting, recognizing, and retaining better teachers? Why do women earn less than apparently similar men in almost every country? Does the discrepancy reflect discrimination or differences in the preferences of men and women? And if the latter, is there a different set of institutions that would reduce the disparity and be more efficient? For those of you listening to this talk, and I'll try to be fast here because I'm realizing I'm hitting an hour, the effect of location on the quality of your research may be important, or you may be interested in the effect of the loss of scientists to more developed countries on the quality of research in their country of origin. We have some good evidence on these questions from Shulamit Khan and Megan McGarvey, but there's certainly room for more studies using different data and different approaches. Since I expect some of you would like to know what they found, here's a quick summary. The large gap between foreign researchers trained in the United States who remain here, there and those who leave for other high-income countries is entirely due to selection. However, those who leave for low-income countries are disadvantaged, presumably because there is good support for research in most high but not most low-income countries. On the other hand, scientists who are required to return to their home countries, at least for a while, are cited more frequently by scientists in their home country. And in turn, the returning scientists cite researchers from their home country more frequently than those in the comparison group. This suggests that the return requirements facilitate the flow of scientific information. This also raises the question in my mind of whether permanent returnees are more or less valuable than those who return temporarily or periodically? To the best of my knowledge, this question has not been addressed. So let me really conclude now. Let me end by saying the following. It's not my role to tell any of you what you should be studying. While I try to give my own students advice, I know from experience that projects about which I'm optimistic do not work out, and others about which I am skeptical turn out to be much more interesting than I anticipated. I will, however, give a few pieces of advice. Know your country's institutions, policy, and data. It is tempting to use worse data to replicate a study done elsewhere because you have a template for how to do the study. On the other hand, if you have access to much better data, a replication study may be more convincing than the original, or some policy may allow you to address a question about labor economics that has not previously been answered or has not been well answered. The flip side, and my final point is that those of you who are in a position to influence government policy should be pushing to give academic researchers broad access to government data if such access is not already available. Many years ago, I served on the advisory board of the Canadian Employment Research Forum. At the time, it was a new organization formed to bring senior civil servants responsible for labor-related policies and programs and Canadian labor economists together. The founder's premise was that the policymakers could not get good advice from the academics because the Canadian labor economists were unfamiliar with Canadian policies. Instead, they were all familiar with US policies and used US data to study them. The guiding belief behind the organization was that if the policymakers got to know the academics, they would make more and better use of them, and that through the policymakers, the academics would learn about Canadian policies and press the policymakers to provide them with data. Both premises proved correct. After several years, members of the organization, some in government and some in academia, launched the Canadian Data Liberation Initiative, which made the data collected by Statistics Canada available to academics. About 80 Canadian post-secondary institutions now participate in the program, and Statistics Canada has set up 32 remote data centers where researchers can access data that is sensitive information about individuals or firms that cannot be released in a public use file. We live in an uncertain world, and one of the uncertainties is what research projects will be most fruitful. But I'm virtually certain that better access to data and greater knowledge of policies and institutions will make it easier for economic researchers to find and complete important projects. I see that I've used up my full hour. I thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Kevin, for your insights regarding labor economics. So now we will go to Q&A section. So do you have any questions in the room so far?
I have a question regarding the approaches to labor economics. For you personally, Mr. Kevin, which do you think is the easiest to follow?
Well, the physics model is hard. It takes a long time to estimate dynamic structural model. And then people are going to say, well, do we believe your model or not? And when you are lucky enough to be asked to revise your paper, it might take you another year. So in that sense, it's the hardest. On the other hand, because it's so hard to do, it can be easier to get, once you finish that paper, it can be easier to get it accepted. Theory, some people love theory, some people find it easy. it's clear that what is caught on right now is the medical model. I think people underestimate its weaknesses. Which is not to say that I want to get rid of it by any means. I think we've gained a lot from the work of people like Josh Angrist and David Card. It's also the case that we can't all be as clever as Josh. He's very good at finding very interesting instruments. So I don't know what's easiest. I guess what I would say is there's a lot of very useful empirical work that can be done. And finding something, even basic facts that we don't know about can be a real contribution. So I have 2 co-authors in Singapore and 1 in China. The Singaporean co-authors have managed to collect unbelievable data on the loans taken out from illegal money lenders or loan sharks. Now, we're not doing any deep analysis. We're just telling people about the loan shark industry, which nobody knows anything about. If you have the ability to collect that kind of data, that's another great thing to do. I haven't really answered your question, but tried my best.
Thank you.
Morning. Can I ask a question, please?
Do you have any questions for Kevin?
Can I give my question to Sir Lang?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Mr. Paskin from the Philippines. You gave us 3 models: causal inference, policy stimulation theory, inspired correlation model, Sir Lang. What if, let us say, I am focused on one particular labor economics phenomena? Can these 3 models be something that I could consider, or should it be subject specific? Or are there criteria indicators that I need to comply with so that I would say that the labor economics phenomena I would like to observe would be best for causal inference? Thank you, sir.
Okay. It might help if I had a clear idea of what you have in mind. I think what I would say is there are a lot of questions that have been answered in all 3 ways. So in the field that I spend most of my time working on, which is race discrimination, there are people who have run correspondence studies or who've run RCTs, and those have been very influential, but they're limited. Right? So if you do a correspondence study, you're acting as if people applied to jobs randomly, which they don't. Right? But it doesn't mean we didn't learn anything from those. It just means there are limits in what we can learn. There are papers that write down structural models and try to determine how much of the pay gap is due to productivity differences and how much is due to discrimination. That's not my strength. I'm not going to write one of those models. Nor, by the way, am I going to do a correspondence study. That's not my strength. Given my strengths, what I've tended to do is to write models that have implications that I can go out and test. Right? And then, so I use the correlation approach. I expect, I'm sure somebody can give me a counterexample. I expect that in most cases, any topic is amenable to all 3 approaches. What you need to do is, probably need to do, is to figure out where your comparative or absolute advantage lies. And then it may be the case that because of the problem you're working with, you need to collaborate with somebody whose absolute or comparative advantage is elsewhere. And I think that's a fine way to proceed. I really do want to push eclecticism here. I try to push it at the Journal of Labor Economics as well.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thanks. Do you have any questions? Yeah, please.
Good evening, Professor Kevin. So, thank you for your sharing. The topic you just shared is very interesting to me personally. So I have one question. Could you please share your perception about the Vietnam labor economics? As like Vietnam is more and more perceived as an emerging economy to the world countries. So could you please share that? Thank you.
I'm sorry, your voice is coming in very fuzzy. I don't know if it's clearer in the room. If it is, maybe somebody could repeat the question for me.
Yes. Could you please share about your perception about like the Vietnam labor economics? Because like Vietnam is more and more perceived as an emerging economy. So it's very interesting and very useful for us to understand perception of like a professor in terms of labor economics in Vietnam. Thank you.
So this is an interesting experience for me. I've had it more than once, which is you're the experts on Vietnam, not me. I haven't studied Vietnam. I haven't been to Vietnam. I'll tell you an anecdote in response, which is I went to New Zealand when I was very young. I think I was still an assistant professor. And I was there for 3 months to study labor market liberalization in New Zealand. On the day I arrived, I received a call from the opposition spokesman for employment asking me to come brief him on the New Zealand labor market. And when I responded that I would rather do that after I'd been studying it for 3 months than when I knew nothing about it, everyone seemed surprised. I wouldn't dare to tell you what are the important issues to discuss in Vietnam. In fact, that's what we should be learning from you. And we should be learning about what's unique about Vietnam, either in terms of the data you have or some policies that allows you to tell us something about how the labor market, how labor market works, that we can't do unless we have your expertise. So let me give you an example that I give with a little bit of trepidation because the student has not yet finished writing the paper, but one of my grad students is looking at the issue of bargaining power within the household. And he's using the hukou system in China, which limits where you can live, or more precisely, limits the services you receive depending on where you live and how that affects bargaining. And we can't do that with American data or European data because we don't have a hukou system. And I hope and expect that he's both going to make an econometric contribution and that he's going to tell us more about the origins of bargaining power within the household. And you can do that because I don't know what they are, but there are experiments that you have, quote unquote experiments, that the rest of us don't know about. Right? Or it could be you have great data about something. So a lot of people in Scandinavia, because they seem to have data in which they record everything that ever happened in your life, are able to answer questions that British and American economists were trying to answer with really inadequate data. Right? And they can take advantage of that. Or one of my friends in Sweden takes advantage of the particular way that basic training of people in the armed forces is done to look at the effect of having a woman in your, I don't know the Army terms properly, but in your group, in your barracks. He can do that. I can't. So take advantage of that.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Dr. Kevin. I'm really interested on one controversial debate that you mentioned, that's work first or education first. And for economic labor, it's really also key aspects of economic, also social issue as well. So based on your data, your experience, we should focus on economic first or education first in terms of economic or education policy. And you say a bit about your experience about that. Thank you.
So I'm not fully sure what you're asking. So there are a lot of questions out there, right? So I think the experimental evidence on work first versus education first is very convincing. We just ran lots and lots of experiments, and there is some variation across the experiments. There's no question about that. And we've done meta-analysis to try to figure out what explains the differences. And I'm sure there's more work to be done there. But I would say, at least for the short-term effects, we have a pretty good knowledge. Now, I was on a National Research Council panel that was looking at issues in the reform of the education system. And we tried very hard to try to convince the government that instead of just deciding what policy reforms would be the right ones, that they should do what we did with welfare reform, which is say, okay, if some state wants to try a different policy, they can go ahead and do that, providing it looks reasonable. But they have to set up an experiment to test its effects. So I think there are a lot of areas where we could do that. And in fact, as I said, we can do this in small bits as well. What is the effect of changing the piece rate scheme in some company? Or what is the effect of, in countries where there's a lot of interethnic conflict, what is the effect of mixing people on the shop floor? Do we reduce conflict in that case? And that's been done a lot in development economics. I mean, that's what Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee and Michael Kramer won the Nobel Prize for. So I think there's a lot of room to do this.
Thank you.
Do you have any email line? So if not, I don't have specific question, but because like sharing that doing labor economics, from my perspective, like we need to have very solid theoretical model, and also how can I say, like the data need to support the theoretical model, because like now today, like a lot of paper, I mean a lot of research, they only look at like descriptive statistics to descriptive the data rather than to see the causal relationship. So therefore it's so difficult, I would say, to look at. Then I mean in Vietnam also, like we limit to have like very good and big data to analyze. So it's super challenging for researchers in Vietnam. But I think that like you can do that with several ways that Kevin also proposed. For example, like to use natural field experiments or to ask some interesting questions that Kevin proposed. So once again, thank you very much for your time, your preparations for the slide and your talk today, Kevin. Then the video recordings will make the subtitles for those who cannot attend today. They can read and follow your talk today. So thank you for your participation. And I also want to highlight that Japanese seminar research will happen next month after the Lunar New Year. Then we have the talk. We got into the comments on game theory. Then we are looking forward to seeing your participation. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Kevin. So because like as normal, we have like you here in person to, how can I say, like to take our photos. But even though we took